Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
In this edition of Global Print, I'm going to talk to you about the recently concluded G7 summit in Cornwall in the UK. And although Prime Minister Narendra Modi did not attend, he took the decision not to attend as long back as a month ago when India and especially Delhi was in the middle of a raging coronavirus pandemic. But the decisions of the G7, which is easily the world's richest and most powerful club, is going to have several repercussions in the months and years to come. But before that, dear viewer, I'd like to make an appeal to you. Please do subscribe and pay just a little bit for ThePrint's free, fair, objective and unhyphenated journalism. You know that we have been bringing to you the best videos, the best news stories over the last several months of the pandemic. So please do continue to support us. You will find links to subscribe in the description of this video, both for an international audience as well as for a domestic one. Now back to my column, Global Print, in which I talk about the importance of the G7, which is the group of seven's richest democracies, Western democracies, of course, and perhaps that's an oxymoron because most democracies are now in the West, save for India and a couple of others. Now, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, along with the Prime Minister of Australia, the President of South Korea, as well as the President of South Africa, were invited to attend. They were the guest invitees, along with the seven countries, the seven richest countries in the world, like I said, led by the US. The host, of course, was Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of the UK. Apart from that, you had Japan, Italy, Germany, and also representatives of the European Commission. Now, Prime Minister Modi did not attend because India was in the middle of the raging pandemic when he said he would not go a month ago. But over the weekend, it was interesting to see how the G7 is dealing with a post-COVID new normal. Certainly, COVID hasn't gone away, but several of the leaders who attended, along with their spouses, did not wear masks. There was some hand-holding. You could see the French president and Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister. Remember that France and Britain are traditional competitors in the European space, although now England has left Brexit, so perhaps it's not as much part of the continent as it was some years ago. But you had Joe Biden, the US president. This was his first outing. In fact, it was perhaps the first outing for several of these leaders after the COVID pandemic has subsided. It's not gone yet. Everybody was very, very careful about saying that again and again. You saw some masks, but in private spaces and meetings and in sort of closed group meetings where you saw some pictures, most leaders were not wearing masks. So that was the first very unusual view of this post-COVID normal. The first big international summit meeting with the world's most powerful leaders. Some of them were wearing masks occasionally, but come to terms with the fact that this is a new normal and that life will have to continue, but everybody will have to take many more precautions. The second was that this was a really clubby sort of affair. I mean, if you see the pictures that came out, and the Twitter handle of the G7 will introduce you to some of those pictures. It was really interesting to see this, very beautiful panoramic view of the sea in Cornwall. It was really quite spectacular, so spare. And the spouses, everybody wearing sort of, very informally dressed, formal, of course, for the meetings. But this very clubby group, so clearly these guys all know each other, although several of them were perhaps meeting for the first time, like Joe Biden was meeting all these others. But the European leaders all seem to know each other quite well, like the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, the French President Emmanuel Macron. They know each other well. They're all part of a common understanding, especially as far as liberties or human rights or sort of fundamental aspects of governance, the market economy. That's a fundamental underpinning of the G7, and it makes you wonder. It made me wonder why South Asia, of which India is the leader by far, and not just in terms of size and population, but in the economy, why South Asia cannot be much more like the G7, why SAARC can't be much more like the G7, but that's perhaps the subject of another conversation. and another debate. This recently concluded G7 was very, very important for 2 or 3 other reasons. The first is that China found a lot of play in the official communique that was released. There was mention of forced labor at Chinese camps in Xinjiang, which is the Muslim majority population district or province in Western China. There was the mention that China should up its game on human rights, and that it was not doing enough. And then there was the mention that, more than a mention actually, there was the demand that China investigate the origins of the coronavirus pandemic. Now, you know where this is coming from. Over the last several weeks, in fact, a couple of months, there is this growing realization that the COVID pandemic, the COVID-19 virus, may not have had a natural origin. Now, China has been trying to say that the COVID-19 virus sort of jumped from a bat to a human, and it talks about the seafood market in Wuhan. But in the last several weeks, including in ThePrint, we've had several interviews with scientists who have said that maybe, there is no absolute confirmation of that, of course, but maybe that there was perhaps an accidental leak from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, one of the many labs that the Wuhan Institute has, and it was perhaps not a virus that has been found or was found in the natural realm, that it escaped from a lab accidentally, and that this is what happened, whether it escaped because somebody, a human being, a scientist or a researcher got infected, or it was perhaps an animal that escaped, which was contaminated with that virus. So the G7 summit's communique, talking about and naming China and saying that it should reinvestigate the origins of the coronavirus pandemic. Now, as you can imagine, the Chinese have gone quite ballistic with the G7 statement and been very, very critical about it, have said that what is a small group of countries that is telling us what to do, and they have no business to tell China, a sovereign nation, to do what it should inside the country. Be that as it may, the G7 has put out the statement named China, almost blamed it, hasn't blamed it so far, but said that the WHO must also relook at what is going on. In fact, that was Boris Johnson at the press conference where he said that perhaps WHO should look at this again. As you know, the WHO team had gone to China to investigate whether the pandemic was caused by human error or by an accidental leak, or whether it was, a naturally occurring event that took place. But anyway, the fact is that the G7 summit has been very, very critical of China. And what that has done is that, at least temporarily, it has let the Modi government off the hook. Because while the communique talks about human rights violations in China, it does not mention any such thing about India. Although there was, in the Open Societies session, and in fact, Prime Minister Narendra Modi was asked to lead that session. He attended virtually. Everybody else was in that room in Cornwall in UK. Prime Minister Narendra Modi talked about how India, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, and how India believed that the earth is one family. And he said, India's democracy as well as democratic credentials lent it the weight of leading in terms of freedom of speech and expression worldwide. Now, everybody knows that India is not a Western democracy, but since its birth in 1947, India has been very, very clear that the freedom of speech and expression under Article 21 in the Constitution is a fundamental right and it cannot be breached. Which is why Prime Minister Narendra Modi talked about this very, very forcefully. And at the end of that Open Societies session, there was a document as well that was adopted by all the G7 leaders plus the guest invitees. The second thing that comes out of the G7 summit, and of course the communique makes it very clear, is that it is looking at ways to constrain China, if not contain China. Now, this has obviously been led by the Americans. Now, if Prime Minister Narendra Modi had gone to Cornwall to the G7 summit, it would have been quite interesting because all the members of the Quad, which is a coalition in the Indo-Pacific, which is obviously the goal of which is to constrain China. So you have the four members, which are India, Japan, Australia, and the US. The leaders of all four countries were there. Third, I'd like to point out here that Prime Minister Modi also made an appeal to the G7 nations like India has done at the WTO. In fact, there is an India-South Africa proposal at the WTO to requesting the WTO members to waive patents on COVID vaccines, other drugs that are COVID pandemic related, as well as equipment and other therapeutics and other material. So at the G7 summit, Prime Minister Narendra Modi repeats this plea to the G7 leaders that, and he talks about, one earth, one health. This mantra that he says is that unless everybody is vaccinated, the one part of the world cannot believe that it is coronavirus free. So even if Europe is returning to a new normal or the US is returning to a new normal where masks are coming off, just because that is happening, and if large parts of India is not vaccinated, or large parts of Africa, like the South African President Cyril Ramaphosa said, are not vaccinated, Europe and the US and other Western democracies must realize that they are not safe either. So this plea by the Prime Minister to waive patents on COVID vaccines as well as other drugs and other COVID related material was listened to very carefully by the rest of the world's leaders gathered there, the G7 leaders gathered there. But we don't hear of much of a response from them. And that is the last important point that I would like to make that emerges from the summit, is that you have Scott Morrison, the Australian Prime Minister, agreeing to what the Prime Minister Modi said. You have the South African President, Cyril Ramaphosa, underlining that this is the need of the hour, that the Western world or the world must come together to help with vaccines. And remember, yes, one of the decisions by the G7 was to donate 1 billion vaccines to the rest of the world, of which the Americans are going to give 500 million. Now, this is going to happen over the coming year. But to waive patents on COVID vaccines and other related material is only, has not gone down with countries like Germany, for example, and Italy, and even the UK. The UK is still holding out, but hasn't said very much recently. And the reason they are not willing to waive these patents and share know-how on how to make COVID vaccines is because these big pharma manufacturers, whether it's Pfizer or whether it's Sanofi, which is French, or whether it's the German vaccine manufacturers, they are saying that we spend so much money on R&D and research and development, so why should we then share know-how with other countries like India and South Africa, for example? What are we going to get out of it? Another question that some G7 diplomats are now asking off the record is that why is it that India does not invoke the compulsory license, which it is entitled to do so under the WTO, and through which it can get drug manufacturers to manufacture, for example, COVID-related drugs like Remdesivir. Over the last year and a half, in fact, 3 countries in the world, Israel, Hungary, and Russia, have done exactly that, which is to invoke something called a compulsory license. And what that does is that while the Indian government would pay this foreign drug manufacturer, X amount of money in terms of royalty, so what this foreign drug manufacturer would have to do would be to share the information of that is patented under this drug, for example, Remdesivir. Now, what Russia has done, for example, is that it has invoked a compulsory license to manufacture Remdesivir in Russia because the US company Gilead has priced the Remdesivir at quite a high price, more than 11,000 rubles. But the Russian version, which is which is called Remdesivir, is priced at about 7,000 something rubles. So the argument being that in the time of a national health emergency, and certainly the COVID pandemic qualifies as one, why is it that India does not invoke the compulsory license route to manufacture at least COVID drugs, if not COVID vaccines, because COVID vaccines are more complicated and perhaps foreign pharma manufacturers are not going to give you that know-how very easily. Now, these are questions that G7 diplomats are asking off the record. We don't have an answer yet, but we know that the Supreme Court, that this matter is in the Supreme Court, that the Supreme Court has asked the government the same question. In fact, that was raised on the 1st of May. The government has come back, not said very much, just said that we have our own understandings with the world and that these would be hampered if we were to do something like this. But it's not very, very clear. So I will leave you right now with these thoughts, which is the importance of the G7 summit, which India was invited to participate in. Unfortunately, Prime Minister Modi could not go because of the raging COVID situation at home, and the repercussions of some of those statements and those decisions that have emerged from the G7. China, first of all, human rights violations against China, which are being censured by the G7, which lets the Modi government off the hook, and also questions on the COVID vaccines and other related compulsory licensing arguments around COVID drugs. That's all I have for you today. Please read my column, Global Print, on the Print's website, and do let me know what you think of this video. Thank you so much for watching.